On the night I was supposed to awaken my wolf, I was supposed to prove I belonged. I proved the opposite. I awakened nothing but silence. The storm moon rose, and with it every wolf in Northreach Keep except mine. They called me worthless. Broken the night I stood in human skin while lightning split the sky. But broken things I would learn are just whole things the world hasn't learned to see yet. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's get to the story. The northern wind screamed through the battlements of Northreach Keep, carrying the scent of rain-soaked stone and the electric charge of the coming storm. In the lower hall beneath the main tower, 18-year-old Marquita Hale pressed her spine against the cold iron railing, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, too simple they always said, like someone who'd given up trying to belong, her hands trembling as she gripped the metal behind her. Her brown eyes, steady despite the fear, fixed on the courtyard entrance where the pack was already gathering, listening for the footsteps that would drag her to her reckoning. "The wolfless servant thinks hiding in shadows will save her," came Counselor Raymond's voice from the stairs above, sharp as a blade against bone. His laughter cut through the rumble of thunder, joined by the eager murmurs of the gathered advisors. "Come forth, Marquita Hale. The awakening moon doesn't wait for aberrations." Marquita's fingers twisted in the worn fabric of her work tunic, the cloth soft against palms already calloused from scrubbing kennels and tending injured wolves. Tonight was the awakening ceremony, when every youth of age demonstrated their first transformation before the Alpha King and his assembled council. At 18, she was at the edge of acceptability, the final chance most wolves were given. She was breathing proof of something the pack feared. A Hale born without a wolf to call. The door to the servant's stair creaked open, and a familiar figure slipped through. Ilara, the healer's apprentice, ducked inside, her auburn hair escaping from its practical knot. At 20, she was one of the few in Northreach who still spoke to Marquita without pity or contempt darkening her tone. "Marquita, they're assembling in the courtyard," Ilara whispered, urgency tightening her voice. "Raymond sent guards to find you. You can't avoid this." "I can't do it, Ilara." Marquita's voice fractured like glass under pressure. "They'll all see what I lack. The entire pack will witness my failure, and then I'll have nothing. Not even the work I do here will matter." Ilara stepped closer, her expression hardening with protective fury. "You're not a failure. You've kept this pack running for 3 years while they look through you like you were invisible. That takes more strength than any shift." Marquita thought of her parents, both gone before her 10th year, lost to a hunting accident whose details the pack refused to discuss. Dead with whatever secrets they'd carried about why she was different, why her wolf had never stirred even in dreams. "They would be ashamed," she whispered, touching the small silver pendant at her throat, a howling wolf worn smooth by anxious fingers, the only inheritance she possessed. "Your parents loved you," Ilara said fiercely. "And whatever happens tonight beneath that damned moon, that doesn't change. You've earned your place here 100 times over." The sound of boots on stone made them both freeze. Alpha King Gupta Blackmore descended from the upper hall with the controlled grace of absolute authority. At 45, he wore command like a second skin. His dark hair touched with silver at the temples, tied back in the warrior's style. His black eyes surveyed Marquita with an expression she couldn't read, something between assessment and unexpected curiosity. "Still seeking refuge in empty corridors, I see," Gupta said, his voice low and deliberate. "How fitting for one who brings such questions to our traditions, Miss Hale. The council has gathered, and my son is eager to demonstrate what a true royal awakening looks like. Your presence is required." Marquita forced herself to straighten, though her legs trembled beneath her. "Your Majesty, perhaps it would be merciful if I remained below tonight. I have no wish to bring further shame to Northreach or dishonor your ceremony." Gupta's expression shifted, something almost like interest flickering in his eyes before his face returned to its mask of authority. "Mercy," Gupta repeated, the word hanging in the air like smoke, "is not refusing to witness truth, Miss Hale. It is facing it with dignity. He gestured toward the stairs with a hand that brooked no argument. The ceremony begins at moonrise. You will attend. The courtyard had been a nightmare of silver light and transforming bodies, of bones cracking into new shapes while Marquita stood frozen in human skin. She remembered the collective gasp when the moon reached its peak and nothing happened. She remembered Raymond's triumphant sneer, the whispers that became shouts, and finally the Alpha King's silent nod that sealed her fate. She has no wolf, Raymond had declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet courtyard. She drains the pack's resources. She weakens our bloodline by her very presence. The storm demands we purge what does not belong. Marquita had barely registered the guards seizing her arms before she was dragged toward the gates. Ilara's cry of protest was drowned by thunder. The storm had intensified as if nature itself agreed with the judgment, wind howling through the battlements like the voices of every wolf who had ever rejected her. "Please," she had whispered, but the word was lost to the rain as the gates groaned open and she was thrown beyond them into the screaming dark. The gates slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her chest. Now, hours later, Marquita stumbled through the forest as rain turned the ground to liquid mud beneath her boots. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and the sucking earth that seemed determined to drag her down. Her thin cloak, soaked through within minutes, clung to her shoulders like a lead weight. Water ran in rivulets down her face, mixing with tears she didn't remember starting to shed. The hollow ache in her chest had nothing to do with the cold. She had given Northreach everything. 3 years of scrubbing blood from training mats, of singing lullabies to restless pups when the full moon made them cry, of grinding herbs for the healers until her fingers cramped. 3 years of hoping that usefulness might compensate for the wolf she didn't have, that service might earn her a place among people who would never see her as one of them. None of it had mattered. Grief gave way to anger as she pushed through a thicket of thorns that tore at her already ruined cloak. How dare they? How dare they take everything and then decide it wasn't enough, that she wasn't enough, that her worth could be measured by a transformation she couldn't control. The anger burned hot for a moment before collapsing into numbness, a gray emptiness that matched the storm-ravaged sky above. Her boot caught on an exposed root and she went down hard, palms skidding across wet stone. Pain bloomed sharp in her left wrist. When she tried to push herself up, her arms shook with exhaustion. The rain was colder now, carrying the bite of early winter, and her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves. Marquita forced herself to stand, swaying, and realized she had reached the edge of the ravine. Below, she could hear the rush of water swollen by rain, angry and fast. Above, lightning split the sky in jagged white lines that briefly illuminated the twisted shapes of ancient pines. She should keep moving, find shelter, survive the night out of spite if nothing else. But her legs wouldn't cooperate. The world tilted sideways, and she barely managed to collapse beneath the dubious shelter of a gnarled pine rather than pitching forward into the ravine. Fever heat pulsed behind her eyes, her body's rebellion against the cold and wet and shock. Marquita pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. Her thoughts began to drift, untethered from the present moment. She saw Northreach's great hall lit with candles, smelled the rich scent of roasted meat from feast nights when she'd served but never sat. She heard her mother's voice, half-remembered and achingly distant, singing a lullaby whose words she'd forgotten. "You're stronger than you know, little star," her mother's ghost whispered in her fever dream. "You just have to find what you're strong for." But I'm not strong, Marquita thought. I'm dying under a tree, cast out and alone, and nobody will remember I was ever here. The acceptance settled over her like snow, quiet and cold. Perhaps this was always how it would end. Perhaps there was a mercy in it, in not having to face another day of being broken in a world that demanded wholeness. That was when she heard the whimper of pain, undeniably real. Marquita's eyes snapped open. Through the veil of rain, she saw movement, a small shape limping toward her through the underbrush. As lightning flashed again, she made out the form of a wolf pup, no more than a few months old, dragging one front paw. His gray fur was matted with mud and darker patches that might have been blood. His golden eyes, bright with pain and something that looked almost like relief, fixed on her with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so small. "Hey!" Marquita murmured, her voice rough from cold and crying. She extended one trembling hand, palm up, the gesture automatic despite her exhaustion. "You're lost too." The pup hesitated at the edge of the tree's shelter, favoring his injured paw. He was shivering as hard as she was, ribs visible beneath his soaked fur. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two creatures the storm had abandoned. Then the pup took a halting step forward and pressed his cold nose into her palm. The touch sent warmth flooding through Marquita's chest, not the heat of fire but something steadier, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after chaos. The pup's tail gave a single weak thump before he collapsed against her legs, his small body fitting perfectly into the curve of her folded knees. "Oh," Marquita breathed, carefully shifting to gather him closer. "Oh, you're hurt. Let me see." She pulled the pup into her lap with gentle hands, mindful of his injuries. His left front paw was bleeding where a sharp branch or stone had torn the pad, and he whined softly when she touched near it. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he pressed his forehead against her chest and let out a sound somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. The storm seemed to ease, just slightly. The rain fell less viciously, and the wind's howl dropped to something almost like a whisper. Marquita tore a strip from her already ruined undershirt and carefully wrapped the pup's injured paw, her numb fingers working slowly but steadily. "There," she murmured. "That'll have to do until we can get you somewhere warm and dry. If we can get somewhere warm and dry." The pup's golden eyes watched her face with an expression that seemed far too knowing for a creature so young. When she finished, he licked her wrist once, deliberately, then tucked himself more firmly against her ribs. Despite everything, despite the cold and the exile and the certainty that she was dying out here, Marquita felt something shift in her chest. This small, broken thing had chosen her. Not because she was useful or strong or had a wolf to call, but simply because she was here and willing to care. "I'm Marquita," she whispered to the pup, stroking his damp fur with careful fingers. "I'm nobody important. I don't have a wolf, and my pack threw me away. But you found me anyway, didn't you? Or maybe I found you. Maybe that's enough." The pup's breathing steadied against her, his small body relaxing incrementally. Marquita leaned her head back against the rough bark and let her eyes close, sharing what little warmth they had between them. If this was how her story ended, at least she wouldn't die alone. At least something in this cruel world had needed her, even if only for a moment. She didn't know how long they sat there, two castaways in the storm, before she heard it. The sound of horns, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. Search horns. The pup's head jerked up, ears swiveling toward the sound. He let out a soft growl, his small body tensing against hers. Marquita's heart lurched between fear and something that might have been hope. Someone was looking. But for what? For her to finish what they'd started. Or for the pup, whose presence against her chest felt suddenly weighted with significance she couldn't name. The horns sounded again, closer now. Through the rain and trees, she could make out the flicker of torches, the shapes of wolves and men moving with purpose through the forest. "Shoo!" Marquita whispered to the pup, though she didn't know if she was trying to hide him or herself. "Shoo, it's all right." But the pup didn't settle. He stared into the darkness, hackles raising along his small spine, and pressed himself more firmly against her as if declaring his choice. The torches grew brighter. Voices carried on the wind, urgent and commanding. And Marquita sat frozen beneath the pine, clutching a pup who refused to let her go, waiting to discover whether rescue or reckoning was about to find them both. Alpha King Gupta Blackmore moved through the forest with the controlled fury of a storm barely leashed. Rain sheeted off his dark cloak as he pushed through undergrowth that lesser wolves would have found impassable. His jaw set in a line that made even his most seasoned warriors keep their distance. Behind him, a dozen of Northreach's finest spread through the trees, torches hissing in the downpour, every man among them understanding the weight of what they sought. "Spread wider," Gupta commanded, his voice cutting through wind and rain. He couldn't have gone far, not in this weather, not at his age. Captain Elias, a grizzled warrior of 50 years with scars mapping a lifetime of service, moved to Gupta's side. "My king, we've covered 3 square miles. If the pup shifted in panic during the ceremony, the storm could have carried his scent anywhere. He's young, barely 3 months in wolf form. He doesn't have the instincts yet to find his way back alone. Then we search until we find him," Gupta said, the words edged with something close to desperation. "Do you understand what it means if we lose Prince Covey's bonded pup? My youngest son's wolf companion, lost before their bond could fully form. It would cripple him, Elias. A royal without his bonded wolf is as good as broken." A younger man pushed through the search line, his fine clothes mud-splattered, his dark eyes wild with fear that mirrored his father's. Prince Covey, barely 20, looked nothing like the composed heir he was meant to be. "Father, I can feel him." Faintly. "He's frightened but not alone. Something's wrong, but also, I don't know how to explain it, something's right." Gupta turned to his son, studying him with the intensity he usually reserved for battle strategy. "Not alone. What do you mean?" "I mean his fear is settling," Covey said, pressing a hand to his chest. "Like someone's calming him. But that's impossible. There's no one in these woods who would dare approach a royal pup, and he wouldn't allow a stranger near him in any case." Captain Elias stiffened, his torch raised higher. "My king, there's something ahead. At the ravine's edge, beneath the old pine." They moved as one, the search party converging on the massive twisted tree that clung to the cliff's edge like a sentinel. Gupta reached it first, and what he saw stopped him cold. Marquita Hale lay motionless against the trunk, her skin pale as moonlight, lips tinged blue with cold. Her soaked cloak was wrapped around something small and gray that rose and fell with breath. The royal pup, unmistakable with his distinctive silver-tipped ears, was tucked against her chest beneath the makeshift shelter of her body, his injured paw carefully bandaged with torn fabric. "Impossible," Captain Elias breathed. Gupta moved forward, something tight coiling in his chest at the sight of the wolfless girl he'd exiled mere hours ago, now dying in the forest while protecting his grandson's bonded wolf. "Marquita," he said sharply. "Miss Hale." She didn't stir. Her breathing was shallow, her body racked with fever tremors. But the pup's eyes snapped open, golden and alert, fixing on Gupta with an intensity that sent a ripple through the gathered wolves. The small creature extracted himself from Marquita's arms with careful movements, favoring his bandaged paw, and stood on shaking legs between her and the Alpha King, and growled. The sound was tiny, barely audible over the rain, but its meaning was unmistakable. Challenge. A warning. Choice being declared. "What in the name of the ancient Pax?" Prince Covey whispered, moving to his father's side. He's rejecting you. He's protecting her." Gupta took another step forward, extending his hand in the gesture that had called countless wolves to heel over his 45 years of leadership. "Come, little one. Your prince is here. You're safe now." The pup's growl deepened, and his hackles rose despite the way his small body trembled with exhaustion. He planted himself more firmly in front of Marquita's unconscious form, his message clear. He would not be moved. "This is impossible," Raymond's voice cut through the moment as he pushed through the search party, his fine robe somehow still immaculate despite the storm. "The creature is confused, disoriented from injury. Remove the girl's body and the pup will follow naturally." "Her body?" Captain Elias's voice was sharp. "She's still breathing, Raymond." "Barely," Raymond dismissed with a wave. "And her condition is no longer our concern. She was exiled. Her fate beyond our gates is her own." Gupta ignored him, lowering himself to one knee despite the mud and rain, bringing himself eye level with the defiant pup. "I mean her no harm," he said quietly, the words meant for the small wolf more than the men around him. "I mean only to help. Both of you." The pup studied him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young body, weighing the truth of the Alpha King's words. Then slowly, he turned his head toward Marquita's still face. He whined, a sound of pure distress, and pressed his nose against her cold cheek. Nothing happened. The pup whined again, more urgently, and this time he placed his small forehead directly against Marquita's chest, over her heart. The sound that emanated from that connection was like nothing Gupta had ever heard. Not quite a howl, not quite a song, but something that resonated in the bones and blood of every wolf present. It was the sound of recognition, of a bond snapping into place, of two souls finding the symmetry they were meant to share. Light bloomed beneath the pup's fur, soft and golden, and spread across Marquita's chest like dawn breaking. Her eyes flew open with a gasp, brown meeting gold, and for a moment the storm itself seemed to hold its breath. The gathered wolves reacted instinctively, every one of them stepping back as ancient instincts screamed that they were witnessing something sacred, something that hadn't been seen in generations. "Impossible," Raymond said again, but his voice had lost its certainty. "She's wolfless. She can't bond with a royal pup. It violates every law of our nature." "Laws," Prince Covey said slowly. His hand pressed to his own chest where he could feel the echo of the bond forming. "Or assumptions we mistook for laws?" Marquita struggled to sit up, confusion and fear stark in her expression. The pup immediately pressed against her side, supporting her, refusing to allow even an inch of space between them. What happened? Why are you all here?" "The pup," Gupta said, his voice careful, measured, though his mind raced with implications he didn't yet understand. "You found Prince Covey's bonded wolf." "I found a hurt creature in the storm," Marquita said, her arms instinctively wrapping around the pup even as she faced the Alpha King who had exiled her. "I wasn't going to let him suffer alone. And he has chosen you in return," Captain Elias said with something like awe. "A royal pup's bond is sacred, absolute. Once formed, it cannot be broken without destroying both parties." Raymond pushed forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is manipulation, sorcery, some forbidden influence she's wielded over an innocent creature. My king, you cannot possibly believe this is natural." But Gupta was watching Marquita's face, seeing the genuine confusion there, the way she held the pup not with triumph but with protective tenderness. He was watching the pup, who had never shown aggression toward his own family, but now refused to let the Alpha King himself approach the girl he'd claimed. Royal pups chose carefully. They sensed power, balance, destiny in ways even adult wolves could not. They bonded with those who would strengthen the pack, who carried something essential in their blood or spirit. They never, in all of recorded history, chose the wolfless. "Captain Elias," Gupta said quietly, his decision made. "Prepare a litter. Miss Hale is in no condition to walk, and we will not risk separating her from the pup. Not yet. Not until we understand what we're witnessing." "My king, you cannot mean to bring her back to North Reach," Raymond protested. "She was exiled." The law, Gupta interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "is mine to interpret. And what I see before me is a mystery that demands answers, not judgment. Marquita Hale will return to North Reach. Not as exile, not as prisoner, but as guest. Under my personal protection." The words sent ripples through the assembled wolves. Raymond's face went purple with suppressed rage. Captain Elias nodded with grim approval. Prince Covey stared at his father with something between respect and confusion. And Marquita, still feverish and shaking, clutched the pup closer and whispered, "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Gupta admitted, extending his hand to her in a gesture that was offer, not command. "But we will. Together." The pup watched the Alpha King's hand for a long moment before stepping aside, allowing Gupta to help Marquita to her feet. She swayed, and the small wolf pressed immediately against her legs, supporting her, guiding her. As they made their way back through the forest, torchlight dancing through rain that had finally begun to ease, Marquita felt the weight of eyes on her from every direction. The pup never left her side. his small body a constant warmth against her leg. And when they finally passed through Northreach's gates, the same gates that had cast her out hours before, she heard the whispers beginning. The wolfless girl who bonded a prince's wolf. The exile who returned under the Alpha King's protection. The impossible thing that should not exist but somehow did. Marquita didn't know what any of it meant. She knew only that the small creature pressed against her side had chosen her when no one else would, and that choice had changed everything in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. They gave Marquita a room in the East Tower, neither dungeon nor guest chamber but something caught between the two. The space was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a writing desk she would never use, and a window that overlooked the courtyard where she'd been exiled 3 nights ago. The door had no lock, but guards stood in the corridor at all hours. Watching. Waiting. She couldn't tell if they were there to protect her or prevent her escape. Not that she could leave. The pup refused to let her more than 10 feet from his side. He slept curled at the foot of her bed, his injured paw already healing at a rate that made the healers whisper among themselves. When Marquita woke from fever dreams in the deepest part of night, she would find his golden eyes watching her, alert and protective. When she walked the corridors with Alara bringing meals she could barely eat, the pup limped alongside, growling softly at any wolf who came too close. "He's claimed you," Alara said on the second morning, setting down a tray of bread and broth that Marquita's stomach couldn't yet handle. "The whole keep is talking about nothing else. Half think it's a miracle. The other half think it's an abomination. What do you think?" Marquita asked, stroking the pup's soft fur as he pressed against her leg. Alara was quiet for a long moment. "I think you saved his life when you were dying yourself, and he recognized something in you the rest of us are too blind to see." By the 3rd day, strange things began happening that no one could explain. The pup's injured paw healed completely overnight, the torn pad knitting itself together so thoroughly that not even a scar remained. The healer who examined him, a stern woman named Celeste, had declared it impossible. Wounds of that depth required weeks to mend, not days, and certainly not without infection or complication. But when Marquita had held his paw in her hands the night before, whispering comfort as she'd cleaned and rewrapped the bandage, warmth had spread from her palms into his small body. She'd felt it like a current, gentle and steady, and the pup had sighed as if a pain he'd been carrying had finally eased. The wolves in the kennels grew quiet when she passed. Not fearful, but calm, their usual restlessness settling into something like peace. The young ones who typically snarled and snapped at handlers would press against their gates to watch her, heads tilted, ears forward, as if listening to a song only they could hear. And the weather, that was the strangest part. The storm that had raged for 4 days began to break on the morning of Marquita's return. By the 2nd day, pale sunlight filtered through thinning clouds. By the 3rd, the sky over Northreach was clear for the first time in a week, while storm clouds still darkened the horizon in every direction. "It's coincidence," Raymond had declared at the evening meal, his voice carrying across the great hall. "Weather patterns shift. To attribute natural phenomena to the presence of a wolfless girl is superstition unworthy of this pack." But the murmurs continued. On the 4th evening, Marquita stood at her window watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose when a knock sounded at her door. The guards admitted Alpha King Gupta without announcement, and the pup's hackles rose before settling again, as if the small creature was learning to tolerate the man's presence. "Miss Hale," Gupta said, moving to stand beside her at the window. He didn't look at her, instead gazing out at the same sky. "How are you finding your accommodations?" "Confusing," Marquita answered honestly. "I don't understand why I'm here. The pup is healing. Prince Covey can reclaim his bond. You don't need me anymore. Can he?" Gupta asked quietly. "Captain Elias attempted to bring my son to visit the pup yesterday. The creature wouldn't allow Covey within 5 feet of you. He recognizes his prince, shows affection even, but the bond has anchored to you, not to the one it was meant for." Marquita felt her chest tighten. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't do anything except try to keep him warm." "I know," Gupta said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Uncertainty. That's what troubles me most. You didn't seek power or position. You simply existed in a moment when existence mattered, and something ancient responded to that. He turned to face her finally, his dark eyes searching hers. You don't feel empty to me, Marquita. You feel like the quiet before thunder, like potential waiting for purpose. I'm nobody, she whispered. I clean kennels. Have no wolf. I'm exactly what Raymond says I am. Dead weight that weakens the pack. Raymond, Gupta said slowly, has been wrong about many things. I'm beginning to suspect this is one of them. Before Marquita could respond, another knock sounded. This time, an elderly man entered, his robes marking him as one of the keep's scholars, his arms laden with ancient leather-bound volumes. His gray hair hung past his shoulders, and his eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had just made a discovery that would change everything. My king, the man said, breathless with excitement or fear. Forgive the intrusion, but what I've found, you need to see this immediately. Thomas, Gupta acknowledged. You have word on the research I requested. Thomas nodded, setting the books carefully on Marquita's small desk. The pup immediately jumped up, sniffing at the volumes with intense interest. More than word, Your Majesty. Found them. The sealed records from the Northern Archives, the ones that were forbidden after the purge of 1773. Documents that were meant to be destroyed but were merely, shall we say, deeply hidden. Marquita watched as Thomas opened the largest volume, its pages yellow with age, its text written in a script so old she could barely recognize the letters. What are they? She asked. Thomas looked at her with something like reverence. They're about you. Or rather, about what you are. They're about anchors. The word hung in the air like a bell's toll. Anchors, Gupta repeated. Explain. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he turned pages, revealing illustrations of figures standing among wolves, their hands outstretched, light emanating from their chests in patterns that looked almost like roots spreading through earth. In the oldest records, before the current pack structures, before the dominance hierarchies we know today, there were always wolves and there were always those who bonded with them. But the bonds took different forms. Alphas led through strength. Betas served through loyalty. And anchors stabilized the entire structure through their very existence. I don't understand, Marquita said, moving closer despite herself. Anchors were born without wolves of their own, Thomas explained, his finger tracing the ancient text. Not because they were broken or cursed, but because their purpose was different. They were meant to be foundations, not fighters. They formed bonds not through dominance but through choice, through recognition, through a kind of spiritual symmetry that allowed them to connect with wolves in ways even alphas could not. Gupta's expression had gone very still. What happened to them? They were eliminated, Thomas said quietly. During the Consolidation Wars, when the great packs formed and kings rose to absolute power, anchors became problematic. Because wolves chose them freely, without regard for bloodline or political alliance. An alpha's son might bond with an anchor from an enemy pack. A royal line might find its power challenged by someone with no wolf to call but every wolf willing to answer. So they were killed, Marquita whispered. And their histories rewritten, Thomas confirmed. The Wolfless became symbols of weakness, of failure, of wrongness. But they were never wrong. They were essential, and we erased them because kings feared what they could not control through force alone. The pup whined softly and pressed his head against Marquita's palm. She felt that now familiar warmth spread through her chest, steadying something that wanted to break. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Raymond stood in the corridor, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes held a calculation that sent ice down Marquita's spine. How fascinating, he said smoothly. Ancient superstitions given credence by dusty books. Surely, Your Majesty, you don't intend to make policy based on legends meant to romanticize genetic deficiency. These are not legends, Thomas said sharply. These are records sealed by royal decree. Hidden, not destroyed, which suggests even those who feared anchors knew they might need their knowledge someday. Or they were simply too sentimental to burn old paper, Raymond countered. He stepped into the room uninvited, his presence immediately making the space feel smaller, more dangerous. My king, I must speak plainly. This girl's presence is causing unrest in the pack. Wolves are questioning established hierarchies. Servants whisper about ancient powers. And now we're meant to believe she's some kind of, spiritual foundation. It's destabilizing everything we've built. Or revealing cracks in foundations built on incomplete truths, Gupta said quietly. Raymond's smile didn't reach his eyes. With respect, Your Majesty, foundations built on truth have kept Northreach strong for 3 generations. I would hate to see that strength compromised by romanticizing a girl who remains, at her core, exactly what she appears to be. Wolfless, powerless, and now, apparently, capable of influencing even our Alpha King with compelling stories and ancient myths. The accusation was carefully worded, but its meaning was clear. Manipulation. Forbidden influence. The same charges that had seen anchors eliminated centuries ago. You overstep, Raymond. Captain Elias's voice came from the corridor, the older warrior appearing behind the counselor with several armed guards. The Alpha King's judgment is not yours to question. I question nothing, Raymond said smoothly. I merely observe. And what I observe is a pattern of unexplained phenomena surrounding one individual. An individual who by all natural law should not be able to bond with a royal pup, calm aggressive wolves, or alter weather patterns through mere presence. If these are truly ancient gifts, then surely they warrant study, understanding, proper containment until we comprehend their full implications. Containment, Marquita repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. For everyone's safety, Raymond assured her with false kindness. Including your own, Miss Hale. There are those in the pack who view these developments with, shall we say, less academic curiosity than I do. Who see threat rather than wonder. I would hate for something unfortunate to happen because fears were allowed to spread unchecked. It was a threat wrapped in concern, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. Gupta's jaw tightened. Marquita Hale remains under my personal protection. Anyone who threatens her answers to me directly. Is that sufficiently clear, Raymond? Perfectly, Your Majesty, Raymond said with a slight bow. I live only to serve the pack's best interests, as always. He withdrew from the room, but Marquita saw the look he exchanged with one of the corridor guards, a glance that spoke of plans already in motion. That night, as Marquita lay awake with the pup curled against her ribs, she heard raised voices from the council chambers below. Raymond's voice, persuasive and urgent. Other counselors joining in. Words like manipulation and forbidden influence and emergency measures filtering up through the stone. By dawn, a sentence had been passed in secret council. Exile permanent and absolute. But this time, Raymond had ensured there would be guards to escort her. Guards who would make certain she never reached the forest's edge alive. The pup woke before the soldiers came. His growl the only warning Marquita received before her door burst open and hands seized her arms for the second time in a week. They came for Marquita in the hour before dawn, when the world hung suspended between darkness and light. 6 guards, their faces carefully blank, their hands iron firm as they pulled her from sleep and dragged her toward the corridor. The pup launched himself at the nearest man with a fury that seemed impossible for his small body. Teeth baring in a snarl that echoed with something far older than his few months of life. Restrain the creature, commanded the lead guard, a man named Garrett whose eyes wouldn't meet Marquita's. Council's orders. It's to be returned to Prince Covey once the exile is complete. 2 guards moved to seize the pup, and his screams split the morning silence. Not howls, not ordinary cries of distress, but something that carried the weight of absolute betrayal, of a bond being torn at its roots. The sound made Marquita's chest feel like it was cracking open, made her bones ache with the wrongness of separation. No, she gasped, struggling against the hands that held her. Please, you're hurting him. He doesn't understand. He'll survive, Garrett said, though his voice held no conviction. "You won't if we don't move quickly." Raymond's orders were explicit. The exile must be completed before the Alpha King discovers the Emergency Council's decision. They dragged her through corridors still sleeping, past servants who turned their faces away rather than witness what was happening. Marquita caught a glimpse of Alara in a doorway, her friend's face wet with tears, Thomas beside her clutching his ancient books as if they were weapons he didn't know how to wield. Neither moved to help. Neither could, not against 6 armed guards acting on council authority. The eastern gates stood open, and beyond them the cliff path stretched into morning mist. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, rolling toward Northreach with unnatural speed, as if nature itself sensed what was about to unfold. Raymond waited at the cliff's edge, his fine robes untouched by the wind that had begun to rise. Behind him stood 3 more guards, and their expressions held the hard certainty of men who had been given orders they intended to follow regardless of mercy or conscience. "Marquita Hale," Raymond announced, his voice carrying the false formality of legal process. "By emergency decree of the Council, acting in the absence of the Alpha King who has been, regrettably, detained by urgent matters of state, you are hereby exiled from Northreach territory for crimes of forbidden influence, manipulation of sacred bonds, and destabilization of pack hierarchy. The sentence is permanent and absolute." "This is murder," Marquita said, her voice steadier than she felt. Behind them, the pup's screams had taken on a quality that made the guards holding him flinch. "You're not exiling me. You're executing me where no one can witness it." "I'm protecting the pack," Raymond corrected smoothly, "from threats both obvious and subtle. Your very existence challenges everything we've built. You're an aberration, Miss Hale, and aberrations cannot be allowed to take root." He gestured to the guards. "Take her to the cliff path's end. Make it quick. Make it clean. And make certain there's nothing left to find." The guards moved, and Marquita realized with crystalline clarity that she was about to die. Not in a storm, not by accident, but by deliberate execution disguised as exile. She thought of her parents, dead in a hunting accident that maybe wasn't an accident at all. She thought of the pup, screaming himself hoarse in the courtyard below. She thought of Thomas's ancient books and the anchors who had been eliminated because their power was the kind that couldn't be controlled through force. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, as if the sky was weeping. "Move," Garrett said, his voice rough. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marquita's feet slipped on wet stone as they forced her toward the cliff's edge. Below, she could see the ravine where she'd found the pup, where this impossible bond had first formed. The drop was sheer, the rocks at the bottom sharp as broken teeth. There would be no surviving this fall. That was when the pup's screaming changed. The sound that tore from his small throat was nothing a creature his size should have been capable of producing. It resonated across distance, across stone, across the very bonds that connected every wolf in Northreach to their pack. In the kennels, wolves threw back their heads and howled in response. In the barracks, warriors staggered as their hearts suddenly beat in rhythm with something they couldn't name. In the great hall, Alpha King Gupta, who had been arguing with counselors who had used protocol to delay him, went utterly still as he felt the bond cry pierce through everything he thought he understood about pack structure. The guards holding Marquita stumbled, their grips loosening as the sound hit them like a physical force. And in that moment of distraction, something inside Marquita's chest answered the pup's call. It started as warmth, the same warmth she'd felt when the pup first pressed against her, when she'd healed his paw, when wolves calmed in her presence. But this time it didn't stay contained. It spread downward, through her feet into the stone beneath her, and the stone responded. The ground trembled. "What is this?" Raymond demanded, backing away from the cliff's edge. "What is she doing?" "I'm not doing anything," Marquita said, and her voice carried a resonance it had never held before, like earth settling after an earthquake. "This is what I've always been. You just refused to see it." Light bloomed beneath her skin, not the silver of moonlight that marked wolf transformations, not the fierce red of alpha power, but deep earthen gold like sunlight filtering through ancient forests. It spread across her chest in patterns that matched the illustrations in Thomas's forbidden books, like roots seeking water, like foundations being laid. The rain intensified, but it didn't touch her. It fell around her in a perfect circle, as if the storm itself was making space for what was about to happen. Raymond raised his hand, signaling the guards. "Kill her now, before whatever this is completes itself." But the guards couldn't move. Their feet had rooted to the spot, not through fear but through instinct, through the same ancient recognition that made wolves kneel before anchors in the old stories. They were witnessing something that hadn't been seen in over 200 years, and their blood remembered even if their minds didn't understand. Marquita fell to her knees as power surged through her. Not domination but connection, not the ability to command but the capacity to anchor, to stabilize, to be the ground that others stood on. Lightning struck the cliff behind her, not to destroy but to illuminate, a crown of white fire against storm-dark sky. In the courtyard below, the pup tore free from the guards restraining him. He was glowing with the same golden light, and he ran toward the cliff path with speed that shouldn't have been possible, his small body blazing like a star. "I was never wolfless," Marquita said, rising to her feet as the light pulsed stronger. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere true, somewhere that had been waiting 18 years to be spoken. "I was never broken. I was the ground you stand on, and you buried me because you feared what happens when foundations choose to rise." The earth beneath Raymond's feet cracked, not violently but deliberately, a warning written in stone. He stumbled backward, his carefully composed expression finally showing fear. "This is impossible," he breathed. "Anchors are extinct. They were eliminated. They can't be controlled," Marquita finished for him. "That's what you mean. They can't be forced or dominated or bent to a king's will. They choose their bonds, and their bonds choose them, and that choice is more powerful than any hierarchy you've built on fear and blood." The pup reached her, leaping into her arms with a cry of relief so profound it made the gathered wolves in Northreach howl in response. He pressed his forehead to her chest, and the bond that had been forming since the night in the storm sealed completely. The sound it made was like thunder from below, like the earth itself saying yes. Wolves across Northreach felt it. The young ones in the kennels, the warriors in the barracks, the elders in the halls. They felt their own bonds strengthen, their own hearts steady, as if something that had been missing from the foundation of their pack had finally been restored. Raymond turned to flee, but Captain Elias stood in the path behind him, the old warrior's face grave. "Going somewhere, counselor." "This is treason," Raymond spat. "She's using forbidden powers to manipulate the pack. You all feel it. She's controlling you." "No," came Alpha King Gupta's voice as he strode onto the cliff path, rain streaming off his cloak, his expression harder than Marquita had ever seen it. "What we feel is clarity. What we feel is rightness. What we feel is the truth you tried to bury with execution disguised as exile." The Alpha King moved past Raymond as if the counselor no longer existed, his eyes fixed on Marquita. She stood bathed in golden light, the pup in her arms, her dark hair whipping in wind that carried the scent of rain and earth and something ancient finally awakening. Gupta stopped 3 feet from her, studying her with an expression that held wonder and something that might have been shame. "I should have seen it," he said quietly. "I should have questioned why our pack felt incomplete despite our strength. I should have asked why the old stories spoke of anchors with reverence, not contempt." Then, slowly, deliberately, Alpha King Gupta Blackmore dropped to one knee. The gesture sent shockwaves through the assembled wolves. An Alpha King knelt before no one, bowed to no power except the moon itself. But Gupta held Marquita's gaze and spoke words that would change Northreach forever. "I kneel not in submission," he said, "but in recognition. You are what we lost, what we destroyed because we mistook foundation for weakness. And I ask not command that you consider staying, not as servant or exile or guest, but as what you were always meant to be. Rancor, our ground." Behind him, Captain Elias knelt. Then the guards, Even Garrett, who had been prepared to throw her from the cliff moments ago. Then wolves began emerging from Northreach proper. Dozens of them, dropping to their knees not because they were commanded but because instinct older than pack law told them this was the moment everything changed. Raymond stood alone, rage and fear warring on his face. "You're fools," he hissed. "All of you. She'll destroy everything we've built." "No," Marquita said, and her voice carried across the cliff path like bedrock settling. "I'll help you build something better. Something that doesn't require anyone to be cast out for being different. Something that doesn't mistake absence for emptiness." She looked at Gupta, still kneeling in the rain. "I'll stay, but not beneath anyone. Beside, as foundation, not subject." Gupta's smile was small but genuine. "Beside," he agreed. "As it should have always been." The storm began to break, clouds parting to reveal dawn light that turned the rain to gold. And Marquita stood at the cliff's edge, no longer the wolfless girl they'd thrown away, but the anchor who would teach them all what it meant to choose belonging instead of demanding it. The pup in her arms looked up at her with golden eyes and made a sound like contentment, like coming home, like a foundation finally settling into place. The council chamber felt different now, though the stone walls were the same, the long oak table unchanged, the windows still looking out over Northreach's sprawling territory. What had changed was the silence that fell when Marquita entered, the pup at her side grown large enough now that his shoulder reached her hip, his silver-tipped ears alert, his golden eyes missing nothing. Raymond stood in chains at the chamber's center, flanked by guards whose expressions held no sympathy for the man who had ordered an execution disguised as exile. His fine robes were gone, replaced by prisoner's gray. His confident sneer had crumbled into something smaller, meaner, like a mask finally removed to reveal the fear beneath. "Marquita Hale," Alpha King Gupta said from his seat at the table's head, his voice carrying formal weight. "You stand as witness and victim. What say you to the charges against Councillor Raymond? Conspiracy to murder, abuse of council authority, and deliberate erasure of historical truth for personal gain." Marquita looked at Raymond, at the man who had twice tried to end her life, who had called her broken and worthless and aberration. She felt the pup press against her leg, steady and warm, felt the bond she'd formed over the past 3 months with wolves throughout Northreach. Connections built not on dominance but on choice, on recognition, on the kind of trust that couldn't be commanded. "Guilty," she said quietly. "On all counts. But I don't want his death." Raymond's head snapped up, surprise breaking through his defeated expression. "I want him exiled," Marquita continued. "Let him experience what he inflicted on others. Let him understand what it means to be cast out, to have everything stripped away. And let him live with the knowledge that the pack he tried to control through fear has chosen a different path, one he'll never be part of again." Gupta nodded slowly. "The council agrees. Raymond, you are stripped of rank, title and pack membership. You will be escorted beyond Northreach's borders at first light. Return and the sentence becomes death. Do you understand?" "You're making a mistake," Raymond said, his voice hoarse. "She's changing everything. The old ways kept us strong for generations. Her way will make you weak, vulnerable, dependent on bonds that can be broken by sentiment." "No," Captain Elias said from his seat at the council table. His scarred hands folded before him. "The old ways made us rigid, brittle, strong in appearance but cracked at the foundation. Marquita's way, the way of anchors, makes us whole." Guards led Raymond from the chamber, and Marquita watched him go with something that wasn't quite pity but wasn't triumph either. Just a quiet understanding that some people would never see beyond their own fear, and that wasn't her responsibility to fix. When the doors closed behind the former counselor, Gupta stood. "Which brings us to the next matter. Marquita, the council has been discussing your position here. Your role. What you should be called, what authority you should hold." "I don't want authority," Marquita said immediately. "I know," Gupta replied with a slight smile. "Which is precisely why you should have it. But I understand your reluctance. So we have a proposal, not a command. Will you hear it?" Marquita nodded, And Gupta gestured to the empty seat beside his own, the chair that had traditionally belonged to the Alpha's mate or heir. "We offer you the position of anchor to Northreach, a title that hasn't existed in over 200 years. You would not command the pack. You would not make laws or lead armies. But you would be recognized as our foundation, our stabilizer, the one who holds bonds together when they threaten to fracture." Thomas, who had been given a seat on the council after his discovery of the anchor records, leaned forward. In the old texts, anchors served beside alphas, not beneath them. They balanced power with connection, strength with understanding. They prevented the kind of tyranny that comes from dominance without empathy. "You would have voice in all decisions that affect the pack's welfare," Captain Elias added. "And the authority to challenge any order you believe violates the bonds we're trying to build." Marquita looked around the table at faces that weeks ago wouldn't have met her eyes. Council members who had ignored her, dismissed her, allowed her exile. Now they watched her with something between respect and hope, waiting for her to reshape what leadership meant. "I'll accept," she said slowly. "On one condition. This isn't just about me. We change how Northreach treats all wolves who don't fit traditional patterns. The ones who shift late, who struggle to find their place, who manifest differently than expected. No more exiles. No more throwing people away because they don't match what we think strength should look like." Gupta extended his hand across the table. "Agreed. We build a new foundation together." Their hands met, and Marquita felt the pack bonds shift, felt wolves throughout Northreach respond to the promise being made. Not a hierarchy being enforced, but a partnership being chosen. Over the following months, Northreach transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The kennel system was restructured, with Marquita overseeing the care and bonding of young wolves to ensure no pup was ever lost or neglected again. Late manifestors were given support instead of scorn, their eventual shifts celebrated regardless of when they occurred. And wolves were given choice in their bonds, allowed to form connections based on compatibility rather than bloodline or political advantage. Marquita worked alongside Gupta, their relationship settling into something neither had expected. Not romance, though outsiders sometimes assumed otherwise, but a deep mutual respect that grew stronger as they learned to lead together. He brought strength and strategic thinking. She brought empathy and the ability to sense when pack bonds were fraying before fractures became breaks. "You were right," Gupta said one evening as they reviewed reports in his study, the now-grown pup sleeping by the fire. "About the old ways making us brittle. We had 3 challenges to my authority this year, all resolved through conversation rather than combat because the challengers felt heard, valued. That never would have happened before. People fight less when they feel they belong," Marquita said simply. "When belonging isn't something they have to earn through dominance." Gupta studied her across the desk, candlelight catching in his dark eyes. "Do you ever regret it? Staying here after everything that happened?" Marquita looked at the pup, fully grown now and powerful, who had never left her side since the night in the storm. She thought of the young wolves she'd helped bond, the late manifestors she'd counseled, the bonds she'd stabilized when they threatened to break. "No," she said. "This is what I was meant for. I just had to nearly die twice to find it." "Only twice." Gupta's smile was wry. "You're more fortunate than most leaders." The seasons turned. Summer became autumn, autumn became winter, winter gave way to spring. The pup, whom Marquita had named Asher for the gray of his coat, grew into a wolf of remarkable size and temperament, bonded so deeply to her that other wolves treated him as extension of her authority. Prince Covey, who had mourned the loss of his intended bond, found connection with a different wolf, one who chose him freely, and the bond proved stronger for the choice. Wolves from other packs began visiting Northreach, drawn by rumors of the anchor who had returned, who had changed what it meant to belong. Some came skeptical and left convinced. Others came desperate, their own packs fractured by dominance without foundation, and Marquita taught them what Thomas's ancient texts had taught her, that strength without connection was just violence waiting for direction. On a spring afternoon 1 year after her awakening, Marquita stood on the eastern battlements watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. Asher sat beside her, his bulk warm against her leg, his attention fixed on the same distant weather that had once nearly killed them both. "Storm's coming," Ilara said, joining her at the wall. Her friend had been promoted to head healer, her compassion finally recognized as the strength it had always been. "Yes," Marquita agreed. "But we've weathered worse." Below in the courtyard, young wolves practiced their forms, their shifts smooth and confident under the guidance of instructors who had learned that patience built better warriors than punishment. In the great hall, the council was meeting, discussing trade agreements with neighboring packs, their decisions informed by both strategy and empathy. And throughout Northreach, bonds hummed with health, with strength, with a kind of stability that came from foundations properly laid. The storm reached them by evening, rain lashing the battlements, wind howling through the towers. But Marquita stood in it without fear, Asher beside her, watching lightning split the sky. She thought of the girl she'd been, the one who had believed her worth was measured by a transformation that never came. She thought of the night the storm had torn the gates from their hinges, the night they'd decided she was no longer worth sheltering. They had been wrong. Not about her lacking a wolf, that had always been true, but about what that absence meant. They had mistaken foundation for emptiness, had rewritten history to justify their fear of power they couldn't control through dominance alone. Gupta joined her on the battlements, his own cloak whipping in the wind. He didn't speak, just stood beside her as they watched the storm rage, two leaders learning to weather chaos together. "Do you ever miss it?" Marquita asked finally. "The simplicity of the old ways. When everything was hierarchy and dominance and clear rules." "No," Gupta said. "Simple isn't the same as right. And what we're building now, it's harder, messier, requires more thought and care. But it's real. It's whole." He paused, then added quietly, "You showed us that." Marquita smiled, feeling the pack bonds pulse around her like heartbeats, like roots spreading through earth, like foundations settling into place for the long generations ahead. "I didn't show you anything," she said. "I just stopped hiding what I'd always been." The storm raged on, but Northreach stood firm. Not because its walls were high or its warriors fierce, though both were true, but because its foundation was strong, its bonds chosen rather than forced, its belonging built on recognition rather than dominance. They had called her Wolfless and cast her into the storm, never realizing she was the calm that would save them all. They had tried to bury her like the anchors before her, but foundations don't disappear when you ignore them. They just wait, patient and permanent, for the moment when everything built on sand finally crumbles and the world remembers what it means to build on stone. Marquita Hale had never been broken. She had been the ground beneath their feet all along, and now, finally, they had learned to stand on solid earth instead of pride. The storm would pass. It always did. But the foundation would remain, strong and steady and unshakable, holding them together through whatever chaos came next. That was what anchors did. That was what she had always been meant to do. And as lightning crowned the battlements and rain washed the world clean, Marquita stood in the storm's eye and knew, with quiet certainty, that she was finally completely home. They called her Wolfless and cast her into the storm, never realizing she was the calm that would save them all. Because worth was never about the shape you wore or the power you wielded. It was about the hearts that chose to beat beside yours, and the foundation you became for those brave enough to build something better. Marquita did not become a wolf. She became the reason wolves remembered how to belong.